The mafia boss walked into my wedding just as the groom said I can't marry a woman who already has a child. No one could breathe. I stood there on the aisle, my white dress stained with blood from the fallen bouquet, while he slowly removed his gloves, his voice deep and cold as a bullet. She's mine. I didn't know why an Italian-American mafia boss appeared at the wreckage of a single mother's wedding, but when his eyes met mine, I understood from that moment on, I was no longer the abandoned bride. I was the prey caught in the hands of the most dangerous man in the underworld. My name is Lydia Evans, the woman whose love and freedom were both bought with a single sentence. She's mine. I can still feel the cold air on my skin even now when I think back to that moment, because I remember how the church just went absolutely silent, like someone had cut the power to the whole world, and all I could hear was the frantic, tiny little beat of my own heart trying to escape my chest. You stand there, you know, in that big white dress holding a bouquet that feels suddenly heavier than granite, and you've spent 5 long years believing that all the hardship, all the nights I cried myself to sleep when Grace was little, the humiliating job interviews, the landlord threats, the moments you realize everyone else is moving forward while you're stuck fighting the same battles just to pay the electric bill, the sheer exhaustion of having to be both mom and dad and sole provider, all of it was leading up to this one perfect sunlit moment. I remember the weight of that promise, the fragile hope that Noah represented stability, acceptance, an end to the judgment, and then he just shattered it. Noah, the man who had promised me forever, who had looked my daughter Grace right in the eyes and promised to be her father, he just drops the microphone and the noise it made was a jarring, sickening sound that marked the end of everything. It clattered against the marble like a gunshot, but it was nothing compared to the chilling finality of his voice, that little sneering edge he put on the word, can't, saying he couldn't marry a woman with a child, that wasn't his stripping me bare in front of every person who had ever judged me for my past choices. It was like watching a movie of your own life and realizing the director just decided to burn the whole set down with you, still standing in the middle of it, the heat of the betrayal searing through you even before the flames had properly started. I remember the sheer dizzying shock of the guests turning their heads not with immediate pity, which I could have handled, but with that awful, hungry, cruel curiosity that only surfaces when someone high up has taken a very public fall. And then Noah's mother, a woman who always made me feel like I was dirt on her shoe, a constant reminder of my humble background and lack of family wealth. She snatched the bouquet right out of my hand, tossing it so hard the roses just exploded against the floor, a brutal floral violence. She didn't even yell. She just said it with this smooth, quiet venom, her eyes narrowed with absolute contempt and satisfaction. Women like her only know how to trap men with pity. That's when the cameras, all the invited photographers who were supposed to be capturing joy, they started flashing rapid fire, capturing the precise, agonizing moment. My entire future evaporated, and the sight of those petals, the white and soft pink, splattered on the floor looking like tiny bruised pieces of my own heart. That's what made me realize this wasn't just a private heartbreak. This was a public execution. A planned character assassination designed to humiliate me into oblivion, and I couldn't move, I could barely breathe, all the air was just stolen right out of that grand, unforgiving church. Then Grace started to cry, and that more than anything, that's what finally broke the paralysis, the shock dissolving into a desperate primal need to protect her from the fallout. My sweet girl, my little flower girl. She was only 6, and she was standing there in her own tiny white dress, the delicate lace on her sleeves soaked with the tears that were just pouring out of her, her small hand clutching the basket of forgotten petals, like it was the only safe thing left in the universe. A tiny island of innocence in the wreckage. She's perceptive, you know. She didn't understand the specific vicious language, not the full sting of trap men with pity, or the financial implications of his rejection. But she understood the atmosphere, that terrible cold silence that meant her mommy was hurting, and that the man who was supposed to be her daddy was walking away, rejecting them both. When she started that high, gut-wrenching sob, a sound of innocent confusion and pain that silenced even the whispers of the crowd, that's when I finally felt the strength return to my legs, not for myself, but for her, because her pain was always my fiercest fuel. I remember shaking not just a little tremor, but a deep whole-body shiver that radiated from my core, realizing the entire world was watching this humiliation unfold, documenting every single shred of my dignity, turning to ash right there under the altar lights, and Noah the coward, the utterly spineless man. He didn't even look back. He just walked right down the aisle, his shoulders squared with a smug, satisfied expression. A performance of self-righteousness that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a sudden change of heart. This was deliberate, a planned and utterly cruel spectacle designed to burn me to the ground and ensure that I was the one who looked desperate and foolish, leaving him looking like the hero who escaped the trap. I felt like I was being erased like an unwanted error before the world's eyes, an insignificant woman disposable at the whim of a petty man. And my only thought was getting Grace out of that room, out of the gaze of all those judgmental, staring faces, and away from the man who had just used us to make himself feel powerful. I didn't say a single word back to Noah or his mother. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a plea or a dramatic counter-argument, holding my silence like a shield. I just lowered my eyes, tightened my jaw until my teeth hurt, and focused all my attention on the small, shaking figure of my daughter, who desperately needed me to be strong, to be the steady anchor she always knew even when everything else was collapsing. You know, when you're watching something like this, something real, something that feels like it's ripped straight from a hidden, vulnerable place inside you, it's easy to get lost in the drama, in the feelings that just rush over you. But sometimes, when you're going through something this heavy, it helps to just pause for a second, right? Just take a breath. Let the world catch up to the emotion. And if you're watching this, if you've ever felt overlooked, or like your dignity was being questioned, if you've been the person standing alone when everyone else walked out, I'd love it if you just took a moment and showed some love for this community we're building here. If you could just open up your phone, take that tiny moment to hit the like button, leave a quick comment below, tell me where you're watching from, let me know you're here, and of course, please subscribe to the channel. It honestly helps more than you know, and it means we can keep sharing these stories, these moments of heartbreak and getting back up, letting the quiet people know they're not alone. It's just a little pause, a soft moment for us to connect, before we dive right back into the fire, because, trust me, the fire was just starting to burn, and it was about to get a lot hotter. I managed to grab Grace's hand, pulling her toward the side entrance, an escape route that felt less public than the main aisle, half stumbling over the thick carpet as my balance was shot. The noise of the crowd finally washing over me, a low, buzzing, contemptuous sound of shocked whispers and camera shutters that felt like a swarm of angry bees trying to catch us and sting us one last time, a relentless assault on my hearing. My heels. Those beautiful white pumps I'd saved up for felt like they were actively fighting against me, catching on the torn lace of the hem, a final mocking gesture from the outfit that was supposed to represent my happiness. And by the time we burst out of the heavy wooden doors and onto the street, one heel had already snapped clean off the small, sharp sound of the plastic, breaking a metaphor for my shattered hopes, leaving me limping unevenly, the delicate fabric of my dress snagged and ripped on the jagged stone entryway. It had started to rain, one of those sudden, aggressive spring downpours, the kind where the clouds just seemed to split open, a cleansing torrent, and the cool water immediately felt like a merciful shock against the raging heat of my humiliation, mixing with the hot, silent tears that were still streaming down my face. The rose petals from the bouquet, which I must have still been clutching instinctively, were now a pitiful wet mess, clinging to the stained white silk of my gown. And one of them, I remember, had a dark, rusty streak on it, that when I finally looked down, I realized was blood, not mine, but maybe from a thorn, or maybe it just felt like my life was bleeding out right there on the sidewalk, staining the ground with my discarded love and dignity. I was dragging Grace, who was now just a dead weight, sobbing uncontrollably into my hip, her small body convulsing with grief, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, terrified that Noah would come out, or his mother to make one last cutting remark, or maybe just to enjoy the sight of me crumbling in the rain, but thankfully they didn't. And I just kept moving, trying to look like I had somewhere to go, even though I knew the only place I was heading was total collapse. A breakdown that felt inevitable and crushing once Grace was safe. That's when the black limousine pulled up. It didn't ease to the curb like a fancy cab or a bridal car. It seemed to materialize out of the downpour, a sudden imposing and utterly silent presence. It was sleek obsidian black and entirely out of place in front of that small-town church, a terrifying, massive contradiction to the quaint local surroundings demanding attention without making a sound. The street was mostly empty because of the intensity of the rain, so this massive, imposing car just dominated the space, a dark, heavy fortress on wheels. And for a terrifying second, I thought it was another humiliation, maybe a TV crew, or someone sent by Noah to try and retrieve the ring, or drag me back inside for more public shaming. But then the driver's side door opened, and this figure stepped out, a man who looked less like a wedding guest and more like a statue, carved from dark, dangerous stone entirely untouched by the rain, his movement economical and deliberate, every action serving a purpose. He was older than Noah, maybe early 40s, with a perfectly tailored suit that didn't look expensive so much as deadly a second skin of power. And he held a huge black umbrella over his head, opening it up and walking toward me with a measured, deliberate pace, his gaze fixed and unblinking, assessing the scene. I stopped breathing entirely, my instincts screaming at me that this wasn't help. This was something far more dangerous, a different kind of predator altogether. And his face, framed by the shadow of the umbrella, was unreadable cold, carrying an authority that was less about wealth and more about absolute, unquestioned control over the space around him, the environment bending to his will. He paused right in front of me, the rain drumming heavily on the silk above our heads, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, resonating rumble, totally calm against the chaos of the storm, a sound that cut through the noise. And he just looked at the torn dress and the weeping child and the general wreckage of me, and he said with an unnerving detachment, "Is this a wedding or a funeral?" A question that carried the weight of a final judgment on the whole sorry affair. I was so startled and so raw, running on fumes of adrenaline and grief, that the only thing I could think to do was scream at him, an ugly, raw sound that was half scream, half sob. "Who are you?" Because I didn't have the emotional capacity left to be polite or even properly scared anymore. I just needed to know why this impossibly intense stranger was interrupting my breakdown, inserting himself into the most shameful moment of my life. He didn't even flinch at my outburst. His gaze just locked onto mine, steady and unnerving, and I noticed for the first time how truly striking he was, not in a soft, approachable way, but in a hard, dangerous, chiseled way, a man whose every line and shadow suggested he'd survived things no one should ever have to see, things that required ruthlessness just to endure and a profound mental discipline. He lowered the umbrella a fraction, bringing his eyes closer to mine. And that's when he gave me the second earth-shattering line of the day, the one that erased Noah's cruelty, with something far more complex. "The only man here who doesn't think you're pitiful." The words weren't comforting, but they were validating an acknowledgement of the invisible dignity I was desperately trying to cling to. And just as I was trying to process that, the sheer audacity of his confidence, the bizarre, unexpected comfort his words provided, the way he seemed to acknowledge my fighting spirit, Grace, who had finally looked up and seen this stranger, she did the most unexpected, moving thing. My brave little girl, she must have seen the profound calm in his eyes, or maybe just the steady presence of a person who wasn't panicking, because she let go of my dress, still sniffling, her tears slowing, and ran straight to him, burying her tiny, shaking face into the side of his expensive trouser leg, clinging to him like a lifeline, sensing safety, where there should have been only fear. And the transformation in this stone-faced man was immediate and total, a sudden surprising crack in the granite exterior that revealed a flicker of something human. Dominic Moretti, the man who I would later learn held the shadow of an entire city in his hands, didn't recoil, didn't look annoyed by the wet, dirty child clinging to his bespoke suit, didn't even hesitate in the slightest. He simply knelt down on one knee right there in the downpour on the wet, filthy street, the massive umbrella now tilting to shield Grace more than himself, creating a small, safe bubble in the storm, and he gently pried her small face away from his suit. He took out a handkerchief, immaculately white-folded, precisely the silk feeling cool against her skin, and I saw embroidered right in the corner a detailed swirling crest that I would soon recognize as the undeniable mark of the Moretti family symbol, a sign of danger and lethal authority. And with the most tender, steady hand, He started wiping the tear tracks and the rain off my daughter's cheeks, a gesture so gentle it felt impossible for a man who looked like him to perform. He didn't speak to her with the usual baby talk adults use to comfort children. He just looked at her, truly looked into the depths of her innocent eyes, and whispered something I couldn't hear, a private exchange of trust that stopped her crying instantly. And she looked up at him with those wide, innocent, and suddenly trusting eyes of hers, a bond forming in that shared moment of quiet intensity. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some chance encounter, some random chivalry. There was a deliberate calculation in his arrival, in his words, in the way he treated my daughter. And I had been right. He wasn't here purely to save me. He was here because of something far more important to him, a larger motive connected to his dangerous world that I couldn't yet grasp, and I was just the unexpected broken piece he stumbled across, a witness, or a link he needed to secure. It wasn't until later, when a sharp-eyed photographer's unauthorized shot of that moment, the intimidating mafia boss kneeling in the rain, holding a weeping flower girl, somehow spread across social media like a wildfire, that the full weight of what had just happened settled over the underworld, and the whispers started low and constant, laced with confusion and fear. Why did Moretti show up at that wedding? Is this a threat? Is this woman the key to something? The answer I would soon discover was darker and closer to my own pain and history with Noah than I could have ever imagined. The next few days were an absolute blur of sensationalized headlines, the kind that don't just report your life, but actively tear it apart and then try to sell the pieces for 50 cents on every street corner, a relentless media frenzy designed to turn my grief into spectacle. Abandoned bride rescued by mafia boss, is she the new queen? Screamed one tabloid, plastered with the grainy, rain-streaked picture of Dominic kneeling with Grace, and the other headlines were worse, painting me as a shameless, calculating gold digger who had instantly traded one worthless man for a dangerous, wealthy one, confirming every negative assumption the society had about single mothers. The whole world seemed to have an opinion on the kind of woman I was, and the consensus, amplified by every comment section and talk show host, was that I was nothing more than a desperate single mother, trading on pity, and looking for a rich sucker to cling to, a narrative that conveniently dismissed all the years of honest struggle and hard work I'd put in. Noah, the man who had abandoned me at the altar, actually had the nerve to go on national television, a full, slick interview, where he looked perfectly groomed and rehearsed, and he sat there playing the picture of injured innocence, talking about how he had dodged a bullet, and then delivering the final public blow with a smug sneer, a performance of moral superiority that made my skin crawl. She's the kind of woman who falls for any man with money. She doesn't understand real love, only transactions. She saw a bigger prize, and now she's clinging to it. His words cut deep, not because I cared what he thought, but because I knew millions of people watching would instantly believe him, would judge my whole life, my character, and my daughter's future based on his cowardly lie. And the shame was thick and suffocating, wrapping around me and my daughter like a toxic, inescapable shroud, making the world feel like a hostile place. The real tragedy, though, was what happened to Grace, the innocent casualty in a war she didn't even know was being fought, her life turned upside down by adult malice. Just 2 days after the incident, I got a call from her school. A cold, clipped voice from the principal, a woman who had always been polite but distant, informing me that due to recent events and the unwanted media attention, and the deeply concerning fact that I was now tied to a prominent criminal figure, they had no choice but to expel her immediately, citing the reputational risk to the other students. They used the term criminal like it was contagious, like Grace would somehow catch mafia from me and infect the other children with a moral illness, and the sheer brutal injustice of watching my innocent little girl, whose only crime was crying at her mother's heartbreak, get punished because of the cruelty and judgment of men. It made me physically ill, a sharp, twisting pain in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Dominic, who had kept a quiet, almost ghost-like presence in my life since the wedding, dealing with the fallout in his silent, calculating way, immediately stepped in. He didn't ask me. He simply told me that I was coming with him for protection, an ominous, controlling word that meant I was moving into the Moretti estate, a sprawling ancient fortress on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by towering walls, armed guards, and an atmosphere of lethal, chilling power that was both secure and profoundly frightening, a definite prison of wealth. The estate itself was beautiful, but felt suffocating, filled with priceless silent art, heavy tapestries, and a deadly silence that seemed to absorb all human sound, making the air feel thick and heavy. And as soon as I arrived, I heard the whispers. Dominic's men, the dark, watchful security, who moved like shadows. They never spoke loudly, but their words still found me dripping with disrespect and assumption. She's just the boss's new toy. Another pretty face to replace the last one. She won't last a month. I knew they meant it, that they saw me as nothing more than a temporary distraction, the next woman who would occupy the large, silent mansion until Dominic got tired of her and moved on. But I didn't care about their judgment. I had long since learned to ignore the noise of the world. I just needed Grace to be safe, to have a place where she could play without the judgment of school boards and the scrutiny of the media, where she could finally find some peace. And I was willing to endure the whispers and the relentless humiliation of being seen as the mafia boss's mistress, if it meant protecting her from any further harm. The estate was a gilded cage, though, and I spent my days just watching the walls, feeling the constant, intense weight of Dominic's calculating gaze, trying to understand what he truly wanted from me, what the hidden price of his protection would eventually be. He was always formal, distant, and utterly terrifying, treating me with a cold, almost detached respect that felt more like he was guarding a valuable piece of evidence than interacting with a person. And I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to cash in on his debt of protection, for the command or the demand that would break my spirit. One afternoon, restless and seeking escape from the suffocating silence, I wandered into a rarely used library, a cavernous room filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of old paper and dust, and there, hanging above the massive marble fireplace dominating the room, with her presence, was a portrait that made the blood freeze in my veins. A painting of a woman dressed in a simple, elegant gown, smiling sadly out at the room. A woman who looked terrifyingly, unsettlingly like me, down to the exact shade of brown in her eyes and the slight curve of her lip. The hair, the bone structure, the quiet set of the jaw. It was my face, but older, sadder, carrying a definite weight of tragedy and resignation. And when I asked one of the peripheral guards who she was, his eyes went instantly cold and distant, the fear replacing any casualness. And he simply said in a low, tight voice, "The late Mrs. Moretti. She died years ago with their son in an explosion." That's when I finally understood why Dominic had shown up at my wedding. It wasn't pity, it wasn't romance, it was a ghost, a terrifying doppelganger, and I was his replacement bride, marked not by love, but by an uncanny, dangerous resemblance to a painful, unfinished past that was somehow tied to my own present, a terrifying realization of destiny. The discovery of the portrait became an obsession, a secret thread I pulled in the tense silence of that massive, overwhelming house, determined to unravel the knot that connected me to this powerful, grieving man and his tragedy. I would stare at the painting for hours, not at the woman's face, which was too much like my own to look at directly, but at the background, picking up small, almost insignificant details in the shadows, and the light searching for anything that would give me a clue about her life or her last movements. I noticed the faint line of a specific wallpaper border, the unique pattern of the tablecloth, and then I saw it small, painted in shadow, behind her shoulder, partially obscured by a heavy curtain, a distinctive, slightly curved molding on a window frame, the kind of architectural detail that was uncommon, but instantly recognizable, a signature detail of a specific building's interior. It triggered a memory, the kind that surfaces when you're least expecting it. A small, painful detail from a life I'd tried to forget. I knew that molding. I had seen that exact curve a lifetime ago, back when I was a struggling young mother, working 2 jobs, scrubbing floors and clearing plates, just to pay for diapers and rent, and one of those jobs had been as a cleaning attendant at a fancy, upscale, utterly exclusive restaurant that catered only to the city's elite, the kind of place Noah's people frequented, a place I had always felt out of place in. I pressed the point, pushing the guard, a quiet, watchful man named Enzo, who seemed to respect my resolve and my quiet efficiency, for more details about the late Mrs. Moretti's life, about the venue for the function captured in the painting, until he finally broke the silence of the Moretti code, his words barely audible. The portrait was taken at a private function at a place called the Gilded Key, a very exclusive venue. And the moment he said the name, the air left my lungs in a rush of terrifying realization. The Gilded Key. That was the exact restaurant where Noah and I had both worked briefly years ago, before he moved into his shady business venture. And before I met him again, supposedly by chance years later, the connection between our lives seemingly random, but now clearly sinister. The connection, once a flicker of suspicion, now became a blinding light of conspiracy. Noah, me, the late Mrs. Moretti, and the same high-end restaurant where secrets were traded over expensive wine and deals were sealed in hushed tones. The coincidence was statistically impossible. It had to be intentional, a thread tying my life to Dominic's tragedy. I immediately went into action, not like a frightened woman seeking protection, but like the resilient survivor. I was digging into my own past contacts, discreetly asking questions among the few people I still trusted, from that time people who worked the service industry and knew all the whispers and back-channel dealings, the ones who saw everything from the shadows, and what I learned was terrifying and precise. Noah, even back then, wasn't just working at the restaurant to earn money. He was running numbers for someone connected to the underground, drowning in massive gambling debts that always made him twitchy and desperate for quick cash. I discovered through piecing together old service logs, discarded records, and rumors from the kitchen staff, who saw things no one else did, that he had sold confidential information, client lists, security protocols, private meeting schedules, everything a fixer would need, to a shadowy rival figure named Santino Rivas, the Spanish mafia lord who was Dominic Moretti's bitter, ruthless rival, the kind of man who would use any weapon, including betrayal, to win. The cold truth settled over me like winter snow. Noah hadn't abandoned me because of grace. He had abandoned me because he was already running scared, deep in debt, and fearing the consequences of his own treachery. And I was just a meaningless, disposable loose end in a much bigger, much deadlier game that had been set in motion years ago, a game I was now accidentally a part of. The realization about Noah's debt and his connection to Santino instantly clicked with the Moretti family tragedy, the devastating explosion that had cost Dominic his wife and child. Dominic's family had died in an explosion years ago, an incident that was officially ruled a random tragic accident. But the underworld always whispered it was Santino's work, a devastating, crippling blow to the Moretti power structure. If Noah had sold security information or private schedules of the Moretti family's movements to Santino Rivas while working at that high-end restaurant, he could have been the unwitting or deliberate trigger that led directly to the attack on Dominic's wife and son, a low-level betrayal with catastrophic consequences that started this whole cycle of pain. The emotional temperature in the mansion shifted instantly when I confronted Dominic with my findings, not with accusations or hysteria, but with the quiet, detailed evidence I had gathered, documents, dates, and names presenting the case like a detached analyst. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't even move. He just listened, standing perfectly still as I laid out the timeline, the cross-referenced employment dates, and the known association between Noah and Santino's low-level runners, processing the awful implication of my resemblance to his wife being more than a mere coincidence. It was a pattern, a recurring element in a conspiracy. His face, usually a mask of impenetrable granite, tightened, and the grief I had only glimpsed in his eyes now became a blazing fire of cold, precise fury, the kind of rage that burns silently and consumes everything terrifying in its control. I chose at that moment not out of fear, but out of a deep moral necessity, a desire to redeem my own humiliated past, to expose Noah's true cruelty, and somehow to honor the memory of the woman whose face looked like mine, to help him find the truth, to act as his unseen weapon in the world he couldn't touch. And I looked him straight in the eye, offering my full partnership. Dominic looked at me for a long, terrifying moment, his dark eyes piercing right through me, assessing my resolve. And then he spoke, his voice turning colder than I had ever heard it, stripped of all human emotion, utterly final and absolute. I didn't save you out of pity. I saved you because you are the truth I've been chasing. And in that sentence, I stopped being a replacement bride. I stopped being a victim, and became instead a dangerous partner tied to him, not by superficial resemblance, but by a shared enemy, and a blood-soaked truth that we both needed to uncover, a truth that had been hidden by the sniveling cowardice of Noah all along. The partnership with Dominic was less like a romance starting to bloom, and more like a high-stakes lethal game of chess played out in the silent, tense, heavily guarded rooms of the estate, where every document we reviewed, every coded message we decoded, every late-night conversation, felt like a bomb waiting to go off, and the stakes were nothing less than our lives and the fate of his empire. I was no longer treated as a fragile, protected guest. I was a resource, my knowledge of Noah's petty hustles, his desperate low-status connections, and the inner workings of the service industry, proving invaluable to Dominic's network, which was accustomed to dealing with presidents and drug lords, not disgraced young businessmen who sold secrets for debt relief. The initial coldness between us, however, began to thaw in the face of this shared danger, replaced by a grudging, then intense respect, and a fierce loyalty that ran deeper than passion or fleeting attraction. Dominic saw my resilience, the way I kept my head down, and focused on the facts, never crumbling under the sheer weight of his world, never asking for pity or special treatment, showing him I was his equal in quiet resolve, and I saw the humanity buried deep beneath his terrifying exterior, the absolute devastating grief for his lost family that still haunted his every move, the almost impossible discipline required to keep his empire together, while hunting the ghost of his past, and the flicker of a profound moral code that defined his ruthless actions. Our connection was built on mutual silent understanding, a recognition of each other's deep scars, and the shared experience of being betrayed by the world. And I found myself drawn to his quiet dignity, the way he carried his immense power, without ever needing to flaunt it, a power that was only revealed when absolutely necessary, and always with precision. It was this growing intimacy, this unexpected bond forged in the crucible of betrayal and shared risk, this shift in dynamic, that Santino Rivas, watching from the shadows, with his network of spies and informants, decided to exploit as a weakness. He knew he couldn't beat Dominic head-on in a conventional battle. Dominic was too powerful, too prepared, too entrenched. So Santino chose to attack the thing that would inflict the deepest psychological wound, my dignity, my public identity, and Dominic's honor, twisting my heartbreak into a weapon against him. One morning, the security around the estate suddenly shifted, the usual watchful calm, replaced by a frantic, low-level panic among the guards as coded warnings came in, too late to prevent the damage. Before Dominic could fully understand what was happening, the massive screen in his private office, a screen usually reserved for high-level security feeds and financial reports, flickered to life, showing a horrifying live broadcast from an unknown location, a hidden studio set up for maximum public exposure. And there I was, dressed once again in a white gown, but this time it was cheap, ugly, and ripped a cruel, immediate mockery of the wedding dress I had worn just weeks before, the fabric feeling like a dirty joke and smelling faintly of chemicals. I was standing next to Noah, who looked utterly pathetic, sweating, terrified, and totally in over his head, an unwilling participant, and my wrists were bound tightly with silk ropes that matched the flimsy bouquet I was forced to hold, the knots digging into my skin, and the tears were streaming down my face, not from humiliation this time, but from pure, unadulterated terror at the situation I had landed in. Santino Rivas himself stepped into the frame, a man whose smile was worse than any snarl, utterly relaxed in his malice, and he looked directly into the camera, broadcasting the entire grotesque spectacle to the underworld, and likely to the wider public, who still remembered the abandoned bride, and were hungry for the next chapter. The mock wedding was designed to be the ultimate psychological weapon, a public shaming broadcast to humiliate Dominic, and break me, completely erasing any progress we had made in reclaiming my honor and exposing our relationship as a farce. Santino's voice, oily and smug, echoed from the speakers in the tense room, a sound of sickening satisfaction, and he looked right at the camera, addressing Dominic with a chilling familiarity that implied an old venomous history. "Look, Moretti. Your pet dressed for the altar again. A man only needs to say no once to escape her, but a woman never washes away that shame, no matter how many rich men she clings to. Her dishonor is now your burden." He made sure the camera lingered on my face, on the terror, and the disgrace ensuring the entire world saw the second, even more profound collapse of Lydia Evans, a moment designed to leave an indelible mark on my reputation forever. I could feel the silk ropes cutting into my wrists, the cheap fabric of the dress scratching my skin and clinging unpleasantly. But what hurt most was the realization that I was being used as a disposable prop in a deadly game of masculine pride, a public sacrifice of my identity intended to wound Dominic. I knew Dominic was watching. I saw the camera swing slightly, revealing a small mirrored surface where I could see my own terrified reflection, and in the background, a reflection of the room where the broadcast was happening. And I desperately tried to send a silent message, a gesture, anything to tell him I was okay, to hold on to my strength. But the fear was overwhelming. Dominic, I learned later, didn't make a sound when he watched that broadcast, but the sound of his heavy crystal tumbler shattering in his hand, the crystal exploding against the polished wood of his desk. Scattering shards like shrapnel was the only noise that echoed in his private office, a sound of absolute devastating fury and utter helplessness that tore through his usual control. He was paralyzed, watching the woman he had silently come to respect and care for being publicly disgraced to wound him. The pain in the room where I was held captive was palpable, the air thick with Santino's malicious enjoyment. Suddenly, my daughter Grace, who was thankfully in a separate, secure part of the Moretti estate, safe and sound, her image flashed onto the screen, a small window showing her watching the mock wedding on a tablet. A small group of the loyal guards standing around her, their faces etched with fear and fury, powerless to help. And my sweet girl, even through her tears and the terror in her small eyes, she recognized the fear in mine, and she didn't just cry. She screamed, her tiny voice piercing the heavy atmosphere of the broadcast, ringing out with a desperate, pure certainty that cut through the noise, a sound of unconditional faith. "Mom, stop crying. He's coming for you." It was the sound of a child's absolute faith, a declaration of hope and defiance that she directed both at me and at the silent watching audience, and her words, broadcast live across the criminal underworld, had an unexpected electric effect. Santino's smile faltered for the first time. His guards exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the kid had just invoked the name of their boss. And in that moment, I realized that my 6-year-old daughter, with her innocent scream, had just weaponized the one thing Santino hadn't counted on: the depth of our human connection and the promise of the inevitable, terrifying retribution that Dominic would unleash for harming his family. The shock of Grace's voice had broken the spell of terror, snapping me out of the paralyzing shame that Santino had intended, forcing me to shift from victim to survivor again. And I looked at Noah standing beside me, the pathetic, sniveling groom who had sold both our dignities for a few pieces of silver, and a fierce, cold resolve settled over me, replacing the tears with a burning, absolute determination. I wasn't going to be a victim, not this time, not for either of these monstrous men, and I certainly wasn't going to let my daughter's faith be misplaced, or her hope extinguished by cowardice. I remembered my past, the years of scraping by, the lessons I'd learned about survival and resourcefulness, when the world had turned its back on me, how to stay quiet and stay ready. And I subtly shifted my shoulders, remembering the small, heavy object I had managed to conceal in the elaborate, cheap fabric of the bouquet before I was bound. It wasn't a rose stem, and it wasn't a wedding favor. It was a small, razor-sharp pocket knife, a tool I carried out of habit from working late-night shifts in dangerous parts of town, and always kept tucked away in a sleeve or a hidden pocket that I had managed to tuck deep into the dense cluster of fake flowers when Santino's men had initially grabbed me, a silent promise to myself that I wouldn't go down without a fight. The moment the efficient, a terrified, sweating man Santino had bribed into participating in this sacrilege began to read the mock vows, I moved. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic lunge. It was a quiet, precise motion, the kind of action that comes from a deep, steady calm, honed by years of hardship. The muscle memory of a woman used to fighting her way out of tight corners and knowing exactly where to apply pressure. My bound hands, hidden by the bouquet, worked quickly, the small, sharp blade slicing through the silk ropes on my wrist. With astonishing speed, the fibers parting with a satisfying, quiet snap. And just as Noah was forced to turn toward me for the symbolic kiss, I pulled the knife free, turning the prop of my humiliation into a weapon of defiance. I didn't stab him. I didn't even yell, denying the room the drama it craved and keeping the focus on my action. I simply pressed the cold steel edge of the blade against the soft, vulnerable skin of his throat, just below the jawline, hard enough to draw a single thin bead of blood that instantly blossomed onto the white collar of his rented tuxedo, a crimson punctuation mark on his deceit. The room went silent again, a heavier, more absolute silence than the one in the church, as everyone realized the mock bride was no longer bound, and was now armed, and I met his terrified, widening eyes with a gaze that I knew was utterly devoid of pity or fear, only a terrifying resolve. My voice when I finally spoke wasn't a scream or a plea, but a low, steady whisper that carried more authority than any shout in that room, demanding the attention of every single camera. "This time," I said, pressing the blade just a fraction deeper, watching the blood well up, a silent contract between us, "I'll be the one to say, no." The declaration was the spark, the exact moment the tension finally broke, and chaos erupted, just as Santino's guards started to rush forward, realizing the entire spectacle was falling apart, and their hostage was now holding a knife. The doors of the building exploded inward, with a deafening crash, showering the room with splintered wood dust and shrapnel, and Dominic stormed in. He moved with the terrifying, lethal speed of a man who has held himself back for too long and is now fully unleashed, a figure of pure, concentrated vengeance. He wasn't alone. His most loyal and precise men followed, moving in practiced formation, but Dominic was the spearhead, an unstoppable force, and the air immediately filled with the sharp sound of gunfire as he systematically disabled Santino's guards. His movements economical, and his expression a mask of chilling, focused rage that was terrifying to behold. I didn't hesitate. Keeping the knife pressed to Noah's throat, I used him as a flimsy human shield, as Dominic cleared the path, maneuvering toward the exit, and when the smoke and the chaos reached their peak, Dominic grabbed my arm, his grip like steel, and dragged me out through the back, straight into a horrifying sea of fire, literally. Santino, in his desperate malice, had set the building to blow a final reckless act of defiance and destruction, and we were running through a corridor that was rapidly becoming engulfed in flames, the heat blistering against my exposed skin, the smoke thick and suffocating as it choked my lungs, tasting like burning chemicals and dust. My cheap white gown, the very symbol of my humiliation, caught fire almost instantly, the polyester hem burning and curling around my ankles, and I kicked fiercely at the flames, not daring to stop or slow Dominic down, while the white silk of my sleeves became speckled with dark, wet splotches of blood. The blood of Santino's men, the blood of the men Dominic had just taken down, a literal baptism by fire and blood. We burst out into the dark night, coughing, running, and Dominic didn't slow down until we were well away from the blaze, hidden in the shadows of a filthy back alley, where he finally turned, crushing me against his chest with a fierce, protective embrace. That was the first truly honest, raw expression of feeling I had ever received from him, a protective barrier against the world. He held me tight, my body shaking with adrenaline and residual terror, and he didn't call me his prey or his truth. He just whispered into my hair, the smoke curling around us, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. "Now this is our real wedding." The defiance in my actions, the terrifying strength I had found in that knife had done more than just save my life. It had awakened his profound respect, cementing a bond forged not from pity or resemblance, but from mutual lethal equality, and a shared commitment to survival in the darkest parts of life. The relief, however, was brutally short-lived, a mere gasp before the next wave hit, because escaping Santino meant running straight into the arms of the law, who were already circling. The world doesn't forgive a woman who wields a knife, not even one who was a victim of a monstrous televised farce, and the legal and public fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Within hours, the police were everywhere, their presence thick and suffocating, and I was arrested for murder at a wedding. The phrase itself, a sickening twist of the first headline, transforming me from a sympathetic victim into a murderous figure who had crossed a line. I was dragged in, still wearing the burning, blood-splattered remains of that white dress, the visual proof of my guilt. And the interrogation was a cold, vicious assault on my character, designed not to find justice, but to strip away every last shred of my dignity and connect me to the real power they couldn't touch, Dominic. The room was cold gray and smelled of stale coffee and fear. "Who's the real father of your child? Did Dominic pay you to do this? What illegal dealings were you setting up?" They demanded repeatedly, their voices dripping with innuendo and judgment, trying to frame Grace as the product of some illicit criminal affair, to discredit my entire life and morality. They were relentless, focusing on my past as a single mother, using it as proof of my moral corruption, painting me as the woman of sin, who was finally getting what she deserved for daring to step outside her place and into the world of men. I kept my silence, refusing to say anything that would implicate Dominic, knowing he was the only one who could truly win this game. But I waited in the deepest part of my gut for him to come for me, to use his power, to get me out, clinging to the hope of his secret vow. But when the news came delivered by a condescending detective, it wasn't a rescue. It was a public, cutting betrayal that tore that hope in half. Dominic Moretti publicly denied any connection to me, issuing a cold, formal statement that I was merely an acquaintance who had been involved in a dangerous situation, and that he regretted the brief association. But his organization had no ties to my current predicament, throwing me to the wolves to save himself. It was a calculated, necessary move, I understood, that intellectually recognizing the strategic genius of his denial, a way to protect his empire, to keep his legal status clean, and to keep him in the game so he could eventually rescue me. But the emotional blow was catastrophic. The public confirmation of my dispensability, and the resurgence of all the old shame. The world immediately latched onto the narrative the mafia boss had used, and discarded the desperate single mother when she became too hot to handle proving Noah right all along. Then came the final crushing blow. Grace was taken away by social services, branded the orphan, whose mother is a killer, her innocent life shattered by the fallout of my love and my struggle, and I was powerless to stop it. The paperwork signed outside my prison cell. I sat in that cold, desolate prison cell, staring at the concrete, the humiliation and the exhaustion finally collapsing my resolve, and I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, the raw words escaping my lips, a plea aimed at the injustice of the universe that seemed to mock my every effort. Even you abandoned me. It didn't matter what logic dictated. In that moment, when I was completely alone, stripped of my daughter and my freedom, Dominic's public denial felt like the ultimate, final act of abandonment, a confirmation that I was still just the discarded bride, and that my quiet strength had ultimately meant nothing to the world that measured worth by status and power. The days that followed were the darkest I have ever known, trapped in the cold, desolate despair of a prison cell, haunted by the loss of Grace, and convinced that Dominic's betrayal was real and permanent. I replayed his words, "I didn't save you out of pity," and convinced myself they were just part of the calculation, that he had used me as bait to get to Santino, and then cut the line when I became a liability, just like every other man I had trusted. But then the whispers started again, this time. Not in the mansion, but in the stale, echoing halls of the jail. The guards exchanging knowing glances, mentioning a powerful judge who had suddenly taken ill and was unreachable. An unexpected series of evidence disappearances that seemed to defy logic, with files simply vanishing from secure storage, and the bizarre news of Dominic Moretti's surprise engagement to the daughter of a prominent federal judge. The pieces began to fall into place. It was a deal, a dangerous, impossible maneuver to trade a fake marriage into the establishment for my freedom, a transaction of monumental proportions, and the full scope of Dominic's calculated sacrifice began to dawn on me, a painful realization that his public cruelty was a meticulously crafted form of private protection. That night, in the quiet, absolute darkness of the women's prison, a sound at the bars of my window, a soft metallic rasp that was both terrifying and familiar, made my head snap up instantly. Dominic was there, cloaked in shadow, a ghost of a man standing outside the steel cage. I was in his eyes, the only thing visible, burning with an intense, urgent light that cut through the darkness. He didn't offer comfort or apologies. He simply reached through the bars, his large, powerful hand holding a single heavy object. A wedding ring. A real one, this time. Simple, unadorned platinum that caught the faint moonlight and felt heavier than any diamond I could imagine. I took it, the cold metal feeling like a concrete promise against the rawness of my palm, And he leaned close, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was meant only for me, cutting through the silence of my despair and answering my silent accusation. I never denied you. I just had to rewrite what love means. It means sacrificing everything you have publicly, including your honor, to save the only thing that matters privately, your life and your daughter. It wasn't the passionate declaration I might have once dreamed of, but it was real, a desperate, dangerous vow exchanged through prison bars and public denial, confirming that he was trading his own freedom, his own honor for mine, using the shadows of his power to orchestrate my redemption and our future. The trial that followed was a farce, a dizzying collapse of the prosecution's case that felt less like justice and more like a carefully controlled earthquake shaking the foundations of the legal system. Every piece of evidence against me mysteriously vanished, from blood samples to video logs. The witnesses contradicted themselves with panicked abandon, suffering sudden lapses in memory, and the bribed judge linked to Santino was suddenly found dead in an apparent suicide. His end, a clear, undeniable message to the entire underworld that Dominic Moretti's influence was absolute and untouchable, and that his reach extended everywhere, even into the grave. I walked out of that courtroom acquitted of all charges, a free woman, but one branded by scandal and the phantom touch of the mafia, my past still clinging to me like smoke. The world was still watching, still judging, whispering about corruption and power, but I didn't care. I was alive, I was whole, and Grace would be back with me soon. That was all that mattered. When I stepped out into the blazing sunlight blinking against the sudden brightness, a black limousine, the same obsidian black, the same imposing, silent presence waited at the curb, and Dominic was standing beside it, dressed in a suit that spoke of quiet, undeniable power, his head held high against the stares of the public, the engaged man greeting his fiancée. He smiled, then a genuine, heartbreakingly rare expression that creased the corners of his dangerous eyes, and he held out his hand, a final question hanging in the air between us, a culmination of all we had endured, ready for our real wedding. I took his hand, climbing into the luxurious, dangerous safety of the car, understanding that I wasn't just marrying a man. I was marrying a world, a promise, and a redemption earned through betrayal and fire, a life that would require constant vigilance and unbreakable strength, a life lived forever in the shadows. Our real wedding, held in a small private chapel, far from the city, nestled deep in the Moretti-controlled territory, was quiet, intimate, and profoundly meaningful, a testament to the respect and fierce earned love that had grown between us in the face of impossible odds. I wore white again, but this time the dress was simple, elegant, and entirely my own, a symbol of my new self-made dignity. And Grace, who was back with me, stood proudly as the flower girl, her smile shining with the joy and innocence that Noah had tried to steal from her, a sign that we had won. The ceremony was moving, stripped of the pretense and spectacle of the first, a genuine exchange of vows between two people who understood the devastating cost of a promise. But even in that moment of perfect, quiet happiness, I never forgot the darkness we lived in, and neither did Santino Rivas. He was supposed to be neutralized, his power dissolved by Dominic's meticulous maneuvers, reduced to nothing. But he was a desperate, vindictive ghost fueled by pure hate. And he chose our wedding day for his final devastating act of spite, confirming that there could be no true peace while he drew breath. Just as the priest pronounced us husband and wife, and the final beautiful blessing was spoken, the chapel doors burst open with a sickening crash, and Santino Rivas himself, surrounded by a desperate small contingent of remaining men, stormed the ceremony, his eyes wild with terminal rage, consumed by his own defeat. He didn't come for Dominic. He came for the only thing that could truly break us, Grace, the innocent heart of our world. His men snatched her instantly, lifting her screaming body into the air, and the camera set up on a tripod near the altar instantly flickered to life, live-streaming the entire terrifying ambush to the underworld, a final broadcast of shame and vengeance. Santino stood over my weeping daughter, his face a mask of triumphant evil, and he held a gun to her small, terrified head, issuing the ultimate agonizing ultimatum: to my new husband, empire or love, choose. Dominic, the cold, calculating man, who never showed a tremor of weakness, immediately dropped the heavy, powerful weapon he always carried, letting it clatter onto the marble floor, the metal sound echoing the finality of his decision. His eyes locked on Grace's terrified face, ready to die right there to save us both, sacrificing his entire legacy for his family. Santino laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the small chapel, shouting with venomous joy, "Mafia men don't get happy endings. You only get blood and fire." The world seemed to stop, the cameras flashing, documenting the inevitable end of the Moretti dynasty, and my brief, tragic second-chance redemption. I looked at Dominic, his face a portrait of absolute devastation, his choice clear. He was choosing love, choosing death, proving once and for all he was not the man the world thought he was, and the tears fell from my eyes, but they were no longer tears of weakness or despair. They were tears of fierce, absolute resolve, a commitment to a shared destiny, and a refusal to let the cycle continue. I looked from him to Grace, whose tiny face was contorted in fear, and back to Santino, and I knew what had to be done, the only choice a woman like me, a survivor who had learned the price of inaction, could make. It was the moment where I finally claimed my own power, my own sacrifice, and I whispered to Dominic, my voice low but utterly firm, "No. This time I choose." I stepped toward him, wrapping my arms around his waist in a desperate final embrace, the scent of his expensive suit and the powerful, steady beat of his heart filling my senses. And as I held him close, shielding his body with mine, I reached up and detonated the small, powerful charge of C4 I had hidden deep within the elaborate floral crown on my head, a precaution I had taken, a final lethal contingency from the woman who had learned never to be a victim again, choosing to sacrifice myself not out of despair like Dominic's first wife, but out of power to save the man who had become my truth and the child who was my entire world, ending the cycle of cruelty with a definitive self-made bang, making sure Santino's reign of malice died with him. The explosion was deafening, a blinding white light that ripped through the chapel, leveling the stone walls and engulfing the entire scene in fire and smoke, a final beautiful, terrifying end to the game. When the dust finally cleared, the world assumed two things: that the woman of sin had taken the mafia boss and the rival lord with her, a final dramatic act of violence, and that Grace was once again an orphan, the tragic centerpiece of a new scandal that would dominate the headlines for weeks. But the empire hadn't fallen. Dominic survived. In that final, fierce embrace, I had secretly managed to clip the small, custom-made bulletproof vest I always wore under my dress onto him, securing it beneath his jacket, turning my intended sacrifice into his ultimate salvation, a final, definitive act of protection. Santino Rivas was dead. His reign of malice and humiliation ended forever, and Grace, protected by the swift action of Dominic's remaining loyalists, was safely spirited away before the police could even arrive, placed under the protection of a trusted family. As for me, the world had no trace, no body, no evidence. I simply vanished in the smoke, the ghost of the abandoned bride, finally becoming the architect of her own destiny, free from the constraints of public life and the endless judgment. I was dead to the world, free from the shame, the scrutiny, and the deadly grip of the past, reborn in the fire I had unleashed, finally a free woman. A year passed, marked by the quiet, steady rebuilding of the Moretti Empire, now purged of its most vicious rival, and the world whispered of the young boss, now colder and more lethal than ever, who had lost a second love to violence, carrying the ghost of a woman he had publicly disowned but privately adored his heart, a fortress of steel and sorrow. Dominic traveled ostensibly for business, moving like a phantom through Europe, checking in on assets and ensuring the safety of his daughter. But one rain-streaked afternoon, he was completely alone, standing inside the ruined, beautiful stone shell of an ancient church in Italy, the exact place where we were originally meant to hold our secret true wedding, the place of our final, desperate vow. He was lighting a single small candle in the gloom, a ritual of quiet grief and remembrance, when a familiar voice, steady, resonant, and carrying the hint of smoke and steel, echoed behind him in the shadowed, broken nave. "Didn't I tell you? You're mine." He turned slowly, his face etched with a year of loss and relentless duty, the weight of the world heavy on his shoulders. And there I stood, stepping out of the deepest shadows in a simple, elegant black dress, a faint, pale scar tracing a delicate line across the side of my neck, the mark of the explosion. But my quiet smile was burning like fire, hotter and more brilliant than any grief, showing him I had survived. The shame was gone, the abandonment a distant memory, and the resilient strength I had always carried was now undeniable, a quiet, absolute power that matched his own, standing on equal footing in the ruins of the past, ready to reclaim our life. I walked toward him, the sound of my steps echoing on the stone floor, and I placed my hand on his chest, right over the steady beat of his heart, my eyes meeting his with an understanding deeper than any vow, correcting the single possessive word that had started this entire bloody journey, claiming our future. No, we're each other's. I always knew who I was, even when others didn't, even when they judged the cheap dress, the old car, the single mother who worked too hard. I was never small, never disposable, and the quiet dignity you carry when the world tries to shout you down, the resolve to keep breathing, to keep fighting, to keep protecting the people you love, even if it means destroying yourself to save them, that is the real lasting strength. That is the kind of power that burns away the shame and leads you to your own truth, no matter how long the journey takes, or how high the price may be. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.